Margaret Doyle had $463 left in the world. The night she pried a door off its hinges and found a room that had been locked for 3 years. She had bought the whole building for $1,148, a dead radio station on a hill in Nebraska that not one other person at the auction would bid a dime on, because the town said it was finished, and the old man who had run it was 3 years dead, and there was nothing inside but dust and mice and the smell of pipe tobacco soaked into the walls. That was what everyone believed. They were wrong. Behind that locked door was a wall of tapes, hundreds of them, floor to ceiling, and not one of them was labeled with a song. Every single one was labeled with a person's name. There was a green ledger full of money that went out year after year, and never once came back. And set apart from all the rest, there was a single reel pressed so hard with a pen that the ink had nearly torn through the box, and it said only this, F4R, do not air. Before that night was over, Maggie would understand that the quiet old man who ran this station for 41 years had been hiding something from his entire town. And within the month, his own son would drive up that hill in a rented car to make absolutely certain that no one ever found out what it was. This is the story of what was on those tapes, and what it cost to let the world finally hear them. The morning her divorce was final, Margaret Doyle had $611 to her name, a 2009 Corolla with 188,000 miles on it, and a brass key to a building she had never seen. The lawyer slid the last page across the table for a signature, and she signed it the way she had signed everything in 31 years of marriage. Quickly, without reading the part that hurt. Then she walked out into a parking lot in Lincoln, where the heat came off the asphalt in waves, and she sat in the Corolla and she did not cry. She did the math instead. $611, a car, a key. The key had come to her by accident, the way the only good things in her life had ever come to her, sideways and unasked for. 3 weeks earlier, killing time in the county building, while her lawyer argued about a retirement account that no longer existed. She had wandered past a corkboard in the hallway and seen a yellow sheet. Delinquent tax sale. A list of properties the county was selling because nobody had paid what was owed. Most of them were vacant lots and a trailer with a collapsed roof. But the last line had stopped her. Lot 14, Calder Township, former radio station KRMW 1290 AM. Structure towers, 1 acres. Minimum bid the back taxes owed. $5,148. She had no business wanting it, no business wanting anything that cost more than a tank of gas and a week of motel rooms. But she had stood in that hallway and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. A small, stubborn pull, like a fishhook set in soft tissue. A radio station. She had wanted to be on the radio once. She had been 17, and she had a voice people stopped to listen to, and she had wanted it so badly it scared her. And then she had married Gary Doyle and put the wanting in a drawer and not opened it again for 36 years. She drove to Calder, Nebraska, on a Thursday in late August, 240 miles northwest, into a country that flattened and emptied until the sky took up 2/3 of everything she could see. Calder had a population of 804, according to the sign, and she suspected the sign was optimistic. Half of Main Street was dark. A grain elevator stood at the north end like a gravestone, and on a low hill a mile out of town, against all that sky, there was a tower, a skinny lattice of steel 199 feet tall, with a red light at the top that did not blink anymore. The auction was held in the basement of the courthouse. 11 people in folding chairs and a county clerk, who read the lots in a flat voice like a man reading a grocery list. When he got to lot 14, nobody moved. The minimum was $11.48, he said. Did he hear $11.48? Maggie raised her hand. A man 2 rows up turned and looked at her, then looked at the others, and somebody laughed, not cruelly, the way people laugh when a stranger steps in a hole they all know is there. Sold, the clerk said, to the lady. He said it the way you tell somebody their flight is delayed. She paid in cash, $1,100 bills and 48 ones, and that left her with $463 and a deed to a dead man's radio station. If you have ever wondered what it costs to start a life over from nothing, the honest answer is that it costs everything you have, and then a little more you did not know you had. Maggie was about to find out exactly how much more. And if you stay with me, because what she found inside that building was never supposed to be found, I would ask you to do one small thing and subscribe, because the part that changes everything is still ahead. The key turned hard, but it turned. The door swung in on a smell she would never forget for the rest of her life, dust and old electronics and mouse, and underneath all of it, faint and sweet pipe tobacco that had soaked into the walls so deep that 3 years of silence had not driven it out. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The light came in behind her in a long yellow bar and lay across a floor of cracked linoleum. It was one low cinder block building, 3 rooms. The front room had a counter and a swivel chair and a microphone on a boom arm, gone gray with dust, hanging over a console of sliders and dials and a turntable with a record still on it. The record was a 45, and she leaned close and read the label without touching it. Patsy Cline, Faded Love. Somebody had queued it up and never played it. The second room was crammed with shelves, and the shelves were full of tape, reel-to-reel boxes and cassettes, thousands of them, each one labeled in a small square hand. The third room she could not get into, because the third room was locked and her brass key did not fit it. She spent the first night in the Corolla in the station lot because she could not afford the motel and a meal both, and she chose the meal. She lay across the folded-down back seat and listened to the windwork at the guy wires of the tower, a low humming moan that rose and fell, and she thought, that is the loneliest sound I have ever heard, and then she thought, I own it now, and somehow that made it less lonely. In the morning a truck came up the gravel and a woman got out, 60-some, in a quilted vest, carrying a thermos and 2 foam cups. You're the one bought Walt's place, the woman said. It was not a question. I'm Lori. I run the wagon wheel in town. Saw your car up here last night. Figured anybody fool enough to buy this could use a coffee. She poured without being asked, and her hands were steady, and her eyes went past Maggie to the open door of the station, with a look Maggie could not name yet, something between grief and worry. Walt's place, she had said. Walt's place. Who was Walt? Maggie asked. Lori was quiet a moment. The wind moved the dry grass. Walt Crane, she said. He ran that station 41 years, alone the back half of it. Sat right there in that chair every night 9 to midnight and talked to anybody who called. Weather, ball scores, lost dogs, a song if you wanted one. He'd read the school lunch menu and the obituaries in the same voice, gentle, like none of it was small. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Then he died, 3 years ago, March, and the night went quiet, and it has been quiet ever since. There's people in this town can't sleep right without that voice. Me, some nights I'm one of them. What's in the locked room? Maggie asked. Lori looked at her a long moment. I don't have that key, she said. Walt kept that one on him. Buried with it, far as I know. Then she got back in her truck and rolled the window down. You be good to this place, she said. It was good to us. And she drove away down the hill. Maggie stood holding a coffee she could not afford to refuse, looking at a door she could not open, feeling for the first time that she had not bought a building. She had walked into the middle of somebody's life. The days that followed taught her things about her own body she had forgotten or never known. She had spent 31 years behind a billing desk and a kitchen counter, and now she scrubbed 3 years of dust and mouse and silence, a symbolic building on her hands and knees, with a bucket and a brush and water that ran rust brown for a full minute before it ran clear. Her knees bruised, her hands cracked at the knuckles and bled, and she wrapped them in strips of an old shirt and kept going, because the work was the only thing she had ever found that was honest, that gave back exactly what you put in and not a penny less. And somewhere in all that scrubbing, without deciding to, she stopped thinking about Gary. There was only the next square foot of floor, the next shelf of tape, the slow uncovering of a thing that had been good once and could be good again, and she understood, dimly, that she was doing to the building exactly what she needed someone to do to her. She was cleaning off the years, looking for what was still sound underneath. She got the locked door open 3 days later, and not with a key. She had been living on bread and peanut butter and the kindness of Lori's leftovers, scrubbing the front room down to Prince Constantine to be in, and on the third evening she found a flat pry bar in a drawer of dead batteries, and she went at the hinges. They were old and the screws were stripped, and it took her an hour, sweating, swearing under her breath at Gary, at the lawyer, at her own foolishness, at the whole flat, empty state of Nebraska. Then the door came off in her hands, and she set it against the wall, and she pointed her phone light into the dark. It was a small room with no window, and the walls were lined floor to ceiling with more tape. But it was different tape. The boxes out front had been labeled with dates and song lists. These were labeled with names, not call signs, not titles. Names Pruitt, Hutchins, Albright, Salas, Vance, dozens of them, hundreds, a wall of human names in that same small square hand. And on a metal desk in the center of the room sat a green ledger book, a reel-to-reel deck, and 2 reels set apart from all the others. One was labeled, in capital letters pressed so hard the ink had nearly torn the box far, "Do not air." The other said only last show. Hold. She opened the ledger first, and what she read there she did not understand for almost a full minute, and then she understood it all at once, and she had to sit down on the floor. Stay with me here, because this is the thing the whole town would have given anything to know, and almost nobody ever did. If you are still with me this far in, hit subscribe and keep that porch light on. You will understand what I mean by that soon enough. The ledger was a record of money, page after page of it going back decades, written in the same hand as the labels. But it was not the station's money, not the electric bill and the tower lease and the cost of new tubes. It was sums going out. $240 October, the Hutchins propane. $400 the Salisbury Gas and Motel Omaha. $62 the Reynolds girls eyeglasses. Funeral Earl Vance, balance after the collection $1,110. And next to each one, in the column where a business would write the source of its income, Walt Crane had written the same handful of phrases over and over. A Friend of the Valley, the Evening Star Fund, Porch Light Account, the names of sponsors. Except Maggie had spent 22 years in a hospital billing office, and she knew a dummy account when she saw one. There was no Evening Star Fund. There was no Friend of the Valley. There was a man who ran a failing radio station in a dying town on the plains, and who had, for 41 years, quietly paid the bills of people who would have drowned without him, and who had hidden every cent of it behind the language of advertising, so that no one he helped would ever feel the weight of being helped. He had made his own kindness invisible on purpose. He had built a lie so that the truth would not crush the people it was meant to save. She sat on the floor of that windowless room until her phone light went out, and she did not move to turn it back on. She thought about Gary, who had given to the church in amounts large enough to be announced from the front. She thought about herself, who had given the way most people give, with one eye on whether anyone was watching. And she thought about a man she had never met, dead 3 years, who had given the way you breathe, without an audience, without a record anyone was supposed to find. In the morning she carried the reel marked last show out to the front room, and she spent 2 hours figuring out how to thread the machine, watching videos on her phone with 2 bars of signal, splicing her own ignorance back together until the tape ran clean across the heads. Then she sat down in the swivel chair, in the dust, in the long yellow morning light, and she pressed play, and a dead man started talking to her. "Well," his voice said, and it was low and worn smooth, like a stair tread that 1,000 feet have crossed. "Well, if you're hearing this, then I'm not the one who threaded the tape, which means I've finally signed off for good." A pause. Tape hiss, the hum of a transmitter long cold. "I always figured I'd die in this chair," the voice went on, "and I'm a little put out that I didn't get to." There was a sound that might have been a laugh. "There are some other tapes in the back. I expect whoever's listening has found them by now. I'd ask you not to judge me too hard for what's in that ledger. A man does what he can with what he's got, and I had a microphone and a little spare cash and a whole lot of nights I couldn't sleep anyway, so. It wasn't charity. I want that understood. It was just paying attention. That's all goodness ever is, if you ask me. It's just paying attention to who's about to go under and then not letting them." Maggie sat very still. "There's one tape back there," the voice said, and his tones changed, dropped, went careful. "One tape says F or R. On it. If you've got any decency, you'll find a way to get that to my son. Russell Crane. Last I knew he was in Denver. He won't want it. He's got reason not to want anything from me. But it's his, and he's owed it, and I've been a coward about it for going on 30 years. A long silence. The tape ran. "Tell him," the voice said finally, and it cracked on the word. "Tell him his mother told me to go." That's the whole of it. "Tell him she told me to go." The tape ran out, and the take-up reel slapped around and around, and Maggie reached up and shut it off, and in the silence after it she could hear her own heart, and the wind in the wires, and a sound she did not at first recognize as her own breathing, gone ragged. She did not know who R was. She did not know what his mother had told Walt to do, or why a man would carry the weight of it for 30 years. But she knew the shape of a wound when she heard one, because she had a few of her own, and she knew that somewhere out there was a man who had spent his life believing a thing about his father that was about to come apart. She did not know yet that getting that tape to Russell Crane would nearly cost her the station, and a great deal more besides. The transmitter was dead, which was the next thing she learned, and it was dead in a way her phone videos could not fix. The tower still stood, the antenna still hung, but the heart of the thing, The rack of equipment that turned a voice into a wave and threw it out across the dark was 60 years old and full of vacuum tubes the size of soup cans, and 3 of them were burned out. And she did not know a vacuum tube from a soup can. She had no money for an engineer. She had $463 minus food, a tank of gas, minus the things that quietly bleed a person when they are poor. And she had no idea what she had bought, except that she could not let it stay silent. Because here is a thing she had learned, sitting in that windowless room with that ledger. Silence is not nothing. Silence is what is left, when somebody who used to hold a thing together lets go of it. And the longer the station stayed quiet, the more it was just a dead building on a hill, and the more Walt Crane became just a name on a stone in the Calder Cemetery, and the more all those people whose names were on the tapes went back to believing that the kindness in their lives had come from a friend of the valley who did not exist. She could not fix that, but she could maybe make the building speak again. And there was something else, something she had read in the ledger and not let herself look at directly. A column she would come back to, but not yet. If you are the kind of person who has ever held something broken in your 2 hands and refused to believe it was past saving, then you already understand Maggie better than her own husband did in 31 years. Stay with me and subscribe if you would, because the man who walked up that hill the next afternoon is the reason this story has the ending it does. His name was Hollis Pruitt. He was 74, and he came up the gravel in a rust-colored pickup with a toolbox in the bed, and he got out slow, the way men get out of trucks when their knees have been arguing with them since 1995. He stood looking at the tower a while before he looked at her. "Lori said you bought it," he said. "Lori says a lot of things. But she said you found the back room. And that's the part got me up here." He had a face like a dry creek bed, all lines and pale blue eyes, and a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat in August. "You found the tapes," he said. It was not a question either. Nobody in Calder asked questions. They just told you what they already knew and watched your face. "I found them," Maggie said. "There's one with your name on it." Something happened in the old man's face, a small collapse and a quick recovery, like a wave reaching the top of the sand and pulling back. "I know there is," he said. "I always figured there might be." He looked away, out at the country, at the long brown grass running down to a creek bottom and the grain elevator far off catching the afternoon. "You don't have to play it," he said. Then he turned back and his voice was steady. "I came up to fix your transmitter. I was the engineer here 19 years before my hands got bad. I know that rig better than I know my own kitchen." He held up his right hand and it had a tremor, a fine constant shake. "I can't do the fine work anymore," he said. "But I can tell you what to do, and you've got young hands." Maggie was 53. She had not had young hands called young in a long time. "I can't pay you," she said. Hollis Pruitt looked at her like she had said something in a language he didn't speak. "Pay me," he repeated. He shook his head, slowly, and the smallest smile cut into the creek bed of his face. "Lady," he said, "you don't understand what that man on that tape did for me. You will when you play it. But you won't ever pay me, and I won't ever let you." He picked up his toolbox out of the truck bed. "Now," he said, "let's go see how dead she really is." He was not the last of them to come up the hill. He was the first of many. But it started with him. They worked on the transmitter for 9 days. Hollis sat in a kitchen chair he brought from home and pointed, and Maggie crawled and reached and unbolted, and her hands learned things her mind did not bother to keep up with. He taught her what a vacuum tube did, that it was just a way of letting a small voice control a big current, like a hand on a valve, and that they ran hot and they wore out. And that was why there was a whole religion of men who used to keep them lit. He taught her why the station was AM, not FM, and what that meant. AM rides low, he said. It hugs the ground in the daytime, doesn't go far, 15, 20 miles, but at night, he paused over a soldering iron she was holding too close to her own wrist. At night the sky changes. There's a layer up there, way up, gets charged by the sun all day, and come dark it lifts and thins and turns into a mirror. And the signal goes up and bounces off it and comes down 2 states away. Walt used to get calls at midnight from Wyoming, from the Dakotas, from a trucker in Kansas. "That's the magic of this band," he said. And there was reverence in it. Daytime, you talked to your neighbors. Nighttime, you talked to the whole dark half of the country. But this, he tapped the rack, this was ours. This was a voice from inside the valley. Maggie soldered and listened and learned, and on the 9th day, Hollis told her to throw the plate switch, and she did, and the meters swung up off their pins for the first time in 3 years, and a hum came up through the floor and into the soles of her feet, and Holawulu Pruitt closed his eyes. "She's lit," he said softly. "She's lit." That evening he did not go home right away. He sat in the kitchen chair with the meters glowing and the hum coming up through the floor, and he looked at all of it, the way a man looks at the ocean, and Maggie made him a cup of the bad coffee she could afford, and sat down across from him. The wind worked at the wires outside. After a while she said, carefully, the way you reach toward a dog you don't know. "There's a tape in the back with your name on it. You keep telling me you know what's on it. I'd like to understand what this place did for you, Hollis. If you'll tell me." He was quiet so long she thought she had asked too much. Then he set the coffee down. "My wife was named Dorothy," he said. "We had 41 years, same as Walt had the station, and then she got sick and it went fast, and one Tuesday in November she was gone and the house was so quiet I thought it would kill me. People don't tell you about the quiet. They bring casseroles, and they say the right things, and then they go home to their own lives, and you are left standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with the refrigerator humming and nobody to say a single." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table. "I had Dorothy's pills still in the cabinet," he said simply, and he let that sit there, and Maggie understood what he was telling her without him having to say it. "I didn't call the station to play a song," Hollis said. I called it because it was a voice, and it was the middle of the night, and I knew Walt would pick up. And he did, and I don't even remember what I said. Something, nothing, and he heard the whole of it underneath the words, the way he always could, and he didn't hang up. He stayed on with me. Off the air, he killed the mic and put on a long stretch of music and just talked to me, low, easy, about nothing, about engines and weather and a dog he'd had as a boy, and he kept me on that line until the sun came up over the elevator, because he understood that if he let me hang up, I might not be there in the morning." Hollis looked at her, and his pale eyes were wet and steady. "There is a kind of medicine," he said, "that isn't in any cabinet. It's just a person on the other end of a line at 2 in the morning, refusing to let go. He gave me that, so no, I won't take your money." He pointed at the glowing rack. "I'm just keeping a light lit that somebody lit for me first." Maggie did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than the silence. But she understood then, a thing the rest of this story would only deepen. The ledger recorded the money because money is easy to write down. But the realist account Walt Crane kept left no entry at all. The hours on a dark line with a man holding his dead wife's pills, the costly act of refusing to let somebody be alone in the quiet. That was the true porch light account. The cash was only ever the part you could count. But lit was not the same as legal, and that was the next wall, and it was a wall with a federal stamp on it. The license, it turned out, was gone. Maggie learned this from a polite young woman on the phone at the Federal Communications Commission after a week of being transferred and held and transferred again. "So I own the station," Maggie said. "The whole thing, the tower, the transmitter, the building." "You own the equipment and the land, yes," the young woman said. "But a license to broadcast isn't property, ma'am. It isn't a thing you can buy at an auction. The airwaves belong to the public. We only loan them out to people who'll use them in the public interest." "And the loan," Maggie said. "Expired," the young woman said, gently like she'd had to say it before. "A station that stays silent for 12 straight months forfeits its license automatically. There's no appeal for the silence itself, it just lapses. And this one's been dark for." She paused. "I'm seeing 3 years, I'm sorry. You'd be starting from the beginning." "How long does the beginning take?" "Most of a year," the young woman said. "Sometimes more, and it isn't cheap." Maggie thanked her and hung up. The hill, the tower, the building, the transmitter, all of it was hers. But the one thing she needed, the right to put a signal into the air, had quietly expired a year after Walt Crane's heart stopped, while the tape decks gathered dust and nobody noticed. And getting it back was a process that could take a year and cost money she did not have and might not get. "I rebuilt a transmitter I'm not allowed to use," she said to Lori in the wagon wheel. Over coffee she finally had $11 to pay for. "I own a voice I'm not allowed to make a sound with." Lori didn't answer right away. She refilled Maggie's cup, and a man at the counter she hadn't met turned around on his stool. He was maybe 40 broad, with a paramedic's blue shirt and a tired kindness in his eyes. "You're the radio lady," he said. "I'm Theo. Theo Salas." He hesitated. "My name's on one of those tapes, the Salas boy." He said it careful like he was setting something fragile on a shelf. "That was me. I was 8. I had a hole in my heart, a thing they had to fix in Omaha, and my folks didn't have the gas money to get there twice a week, let alone the rest of it. And one day there was an envelope. No name. And then there was another one. And my mother used to say it was God, and maybe it was, but I've grown up some, and I read the paper when they found that ledger got bought, along with the station, and now I think God's name was Walt Crane. He looked down at his coffee. I'm an EMT now, he said. I pull people out of cars on Highway 12. I've thought a lot about why. And I'd like to help you, if you'll let me, because I am, when you get down to it, a project he finished. Maggie did not know yet that within a month there would be 11 of them. 12. A kitchen chair brigade of people whose names were on those tapes, hauling lumber and painting cinder block and arguing about antennas. She only knew in that moment that she had been wrong about being alone. She had been so sure of it. She had built a whole self around it, and it was coming undone, one stranger at a time, in a diner on the high plains. If you have made it this far, then you and I both know where this is heading, that a town can be saved by the quiet ones, the ones nobody notices. Subscribe and stay with me, because everything I have told you so far is the part where it gets better. And I have not yet told you about the man who came to take it all away. His name was Russell Crane, and he came in October in a gray rental car that did not belong on a gravel road, and he was Walt's son. Maggie was up the tower when he arrived, 40 feet up, helping Theo and a wind farm lineman named Cody reclamp a feed line that had come loose, and she watched the gray car come up the hill from a height where everything looks like a model of itself. She watched a man get out in a quarter-zip sweater and good shoes and stand looking at the building, the tower, the people, with his hands on his hips and his head tipped back. And even from 40 feet she could read the set of his shoulders. It was the set of a man doing sums, not the kind of sums she had done in a courthouse parking lot, the survival kind. The other kind, the kind that asks what a thing is worth. She came down, he met her at the base of the tower and put out his hand, and it was a good handshake, practiced, warm at the surface. Russell Crane, he said. I think you bought my father's station. She knew it before he said the name. He had Walt's voice. Not the warmth of it, the tape's gentleness was nowhere in him. But the timbre, the low, smooth grain of it, was identical, and hearing it come out of a stranger in a quarter zip was one of the strangest things that had happened to her yet. She thought. Foro, I'm sorry for your loss, she said. Something flickered across his face, quick gone. It's been 3 years, he said. He looked at the building. I'd given up on this place, he said. Frankly, I'd given up on it the day I left it, 30 years ago. I didn't pay the taxes because I didn't want it, and I figured the county would scrap it, and that would be the end of a chapter I was glad to close. He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes, and Maggie thought of Gary, who had smiled at her exactly that way across a lawyer's table. And then, he said, a fellow from a wireless company called my old number looking for next of kin. Wanted to talk about the tower. And I started doing a little reading. Here it was. She felt it coming the way you feel weather change on the plains. A pressure, a stillness, the grass going flat. You probably don't know what you've got, Russell said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. This hill is the high point for 9 miles. Line of sight in every direction. There are 2 wireless carriers that would put antennas on that tower tomorrow and pay you to do it. Ground lease, co-location, the whole arrangement. He named a number. It was a monthly number. It was more money per month than Maggie had ever made in her life. I imagine, he said gently, watching her face, that's a meaningful figure for someone in your situation. It was, God help her, it was. She thought of $400. She thought of the Corolla and its 188,000 miles. She thought of a future that had been, for 3 months, a sheer wall, and here was a man offering her a door in it. So here's what I'd propose, Russell said. I'll buy it from you. I'll give you a fair price. More than fair, more than triple what you paid, and you walk away with cash in your pocket and no more cold nights in that car Lori told me about. And I'll handle the carriers, the lease, all of it. He spread his hands. It's a clean deal. You came out way ahead on a building nobody wanted. Everybody wins. And the tapes, Maggie said, a pause, very small. The what? The tapes, she said, the recordings, the ledger. Your father's, there are hundreds of them. They're a record of 40 years of this town. They're a record of him. She watched his face and saw the thing she was looking for, and dreading both, saw it move behind his eyes like a fish under ice. You don't know about them, she said. I know my father spent every night of my childhood in this building. Instead of at home, Russell said, and the warmth was gone now. The surface had cracked, and under it was something old and cold and very tired. I know whatever's on those tapes. I lived next to it for 19 years, and it never once turned around and looked at me. So no, I don't want the tapes. Burn them for all I care. He took a breath, recovered, the businessman sliding back over the sun like a door. "I want the hill," he said. "I want what it's worth. And I'm offering you a way out of a hard life, which is more than this place ever offered me. Think about it." He left a card on the hood of the Corolla and got in the gray car and drove down the hill, and Maggie stood there in the wind with Theo and Cody watching from the tower. And she understood that she had just met the antagonist of her own story, and that he was not a monster. He was a son who had been left for a microphone, and that was so much harder. Stay with me, because the choice she made that night is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and if you have ever had to choose between what would save you and what would be true, subscribe, because you already know it is not as easy a choice as people pretend. She did not sleep. She sat in the front room with the meters glowing and the transmitter humming its illegal, beautiful hum into a tower it was not allowed to feed, and she did the worst kind of math, the kind where every column has a person in it. She could take the money. It was real, and it was more than real. It was rescue, and no one could fault her for it. A woman of 53 with $400 and a dead marriage, taking a lifeline. She could sell the hill to Russell Crane and let him lease it to the carriers and drive her Corolla south to somewhere warm and never be cold in a car again. And the tapes would sit in a storage unit somewhere, or a landfill, and the names on them, Pruitt, Hutchins, Albright, Salas, Vance, would go on believing in the friend of the valley, and Walt Crane would stay a man who spent every night in a building instead of at home, and that would be the end of it. Everybody wins, Russell had said. She turned the phrase over, everybody wins. It was the kind of thing people said when they had decided in advance that some people did not count. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and went into the back room and took down the tape marked Hutchins, because Hollis had told her, days ago, that if she really wanted to understand what the station had been, she should listen to the night of the blizzard. "Pull the Hutchins tape," he'd said, "and the Albright one. They're the same night, you'll see." She threaded it and pressed play, and the room filled with a wind that was not the wind outside her own window, but a wind from 30 years ago, howling behind Walt Crane's voice as he read road closures off a sheet. Highway 12 closed at the loop, the county roads impassable, and his voice was calm, the way a hand on your shoulder is calm. "Folks," he said, "if you're warm, stay warm. If you're not, the church basement is open and the furnace is going, and there's coffee and there's cots, and pastor's got the doors unlocked. Just come." And then again and again through the long tape the names. "This goes out to the Hutchins place, you folks hanging in. This is for the Albright family out on Sandhill Road. Your boy got through to me, the plow's coming, hold tight." He stayed on through the night, hour after hour, a single voice in a white roaring dark, and Maggie understood, sitting in the cold, that on the worst night in the history of that county, the only thing connecting 100 frightened, isolated farmhouses to each other and to help was one old man and a microphone and a signal bouncing down off a sky that had turned into a mirror. And then, near the end of the tape, his voice broke. It was so brief she almost missed it. He was reading another closure, and his voice simply stopped, mid-sentence, for 4 full seconds. Tape hiss, the wind behind him. And then he came back, and his voice was different, sanded down to nothing, and he said, "I'm going to play a song now." And he played Faded Love, the Patsy Cline 45, the one still cued on the turntable 3 years after he died, and he let it play all the way through and said nothing over it. And when it ended, he cleared his throat and went back to reading road closures like a man walking back into a fire. Maggie did not understand it yet, but she had heard man's heartbreak in real time on a tape from 30 years ago, and she could not stop thinking about it, and she did not take Russell Crane's money. And in the morning she called him and said no, and the trouble started in earnest the very next week. It started with a letter the way real trouble always does, a lawyer's letter on heavy paper informing Ms. Margaret Doyle that the structure on Lot 14 was in violation of multiple county building codes, that the tower had not passed a structural inspection in over a decade, that the property was being formally reviewed for designation as a hazard, and that condemnation proceedings might follow. It was signed by a firm in Denver, Russell's firm or near enough. Maggie read it twice and felt the old cold settle into her, the courthouse parking lot cold, the you do not count cold. He could not legally take the hill from her, so he was going to make it impossible for her to keep. If you've come this far with Maggie, then you've felt this exact kind of cold yourself, the feeling that someone with more money has decided you are a problem to be solved. Subscribe and keep going, because what the people of Calder did next is the reason I wanted to tell you this story at all. She brought the letter to the wagon wheel because she did not know where else to bring it. And Lori read it standing up, and her jaw set, and she walked it around the diner table to table like a collection plate. By the time the coffee was cold, 8 people had read it, and by the next morning the whole town had, and something Mag did not expect began to happen. It was not loud. Nothing in Calder was loud, but a retired county surveyor named Dale Okafor showed up at the station with a clipboard and a transit and spent 2 days documenting the tower and pronounced it, in writing, sound, his stamp still good, his license still active, a favor he did not explain. A woman named Pearl Hutchins, 81, the Hutchins of the Blizzard tape, drove up the hill in a Buick the size of a boat and pressed $300 into Maggie's hand and would not take it back. He kept my house warm the winter after my Carl passed, she said, paid the propane man and told me it was a church fund. I knew it wasn't. I'm old, not stupid. She closed Maggie's fingers over the bills. You let me keep his light on, she said. And Gene Albright, the Albright of the same tape, a big, slow rancher in his 40s, came and stood in the station and looked at the equipment a long time and finally said, I was 14 the night of that blizzard. My dad was out in it trying to get to the cattle, and he went down in the dark and couldn't get up. And I ran to the phone and called the station, because it was the only number I knew by heart. Every kid in this county knew it by heart. And Walt put it out on the air, and a neighbor heard it and got to my dad before he froze. He paused. My dad lived 11 more years on account of that. I named my own boy Walter. He looked at Maggie. Whatever you need, he said. The Albright place is yours. And then there was Lori. She had been the one to bring Maggie coffee on that first cold morning, the one who walked the lawyer's letter around the diner like a collection plate, and she had never once spoken about her own name being on that wall. But on a gray afternoon in late November she drove up the hill, and she did not bring a thermos this time. And she stood in the front room a while before she could get the words out. The Vance tape, she said. You haven't played it. Maggie said she hadn't, that she only played the ones the people gave her leave to. Lori nodded slowly. Earl was my husband, she said. He died of a heart thing, sudden no warning, 14 years back, and we'd been just scraping by with the diner and a funeral, even a plain one, even out here. It's more money than a person grieving has any business having to find. And I didn't have it, and I was standing in that funeral home, making a fool of myself trying to choose the cheapest of everything while my husband lay in the back, and the man told me, real gentle, that it was handled, that an account had covered it. The Evening Star Fund, he said. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, once hard. I knew there was no such fund. I knew it was Walt. Everybody who got help knew in their hearts, even while we let ourselves believe it was the church or the county or God. We let him give it to us, in the dark, because that was the only way he'd give it. And taking it that way was the kindness we could do him back. She put 2 fingers on the box that said Vance, not pulling it down, just touching it, the way Pearl Hutchins had closed Maggie's fingers over the bills. There's another reason I came up, Lori said. Earl had a brother, Tommy. They'd fallen out years before, ugly, over nothing, and hadn't spoken in a decade, and when Earl died I had no way to even reach Tommy. And Walt put it out on the night show. Just a few words, the way he did. This goes out to a Tommy Vance. Your brother Earl has passed. Your sister Lori would like to hear from you. And that signal went up off this tower and bounced off the sky. And 3 days later my phone rang, and it was Tommy crying, calling from a truck stop in Wyoming where he'd heard it at 2 in the morning on a radio in a diner. He came home for the funeral. We made it up. He was at my table every Thanksgiving until he passed 2 years ago. She looked at Maggie. That's what this hill is, she said. It isn't a building, and it isn't a tower, and it surely isn't a cell phone lease. It's the thing that found my husband's brother in the dark and brought him home. You hold on to it. If you have ever tried to have someone you and ached for one more chance to make it right, then you understand exactly why Lori Vance drove up that hill. Subscribe and stay with me, because Russell Crane is about to walk back into this story, and he, of all people, is about to learn what it costs to throw away a hill like this one. Maggie understood, slowly, what was happening. The town was not rallying to a woman they barely knew. They were rallying to Walt Crane, 3 years too late, the only way left to them, by protecting the thing he had left behind. And the more they did it, the more the tapes mattered, and the more Maggie understood that she was not the owner of those tapes. She was their keeper. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference, and learning it was the thing that finally changed her. But Russell was not done. He came back in November, and this time he did not offer her money. This time he came to the wagon wheel where she ate, and he sat down across from her in the booth, uninvited, and he had aged a decade in a month. His good sweater was wrinkled. There was gray in his stubble. And the businessman was gone, worn through, and underneath was just the sun, and the sun was furious and breaking. "You want to know about him," he said. "Everybody in this town wants me to know about him, like I didn't live it." He leaned in. "You found tapes, fine. You found out he was generous. Let me tell you what I found out growing up in his house. My father had a bottomless, biblical supply of patience and tenderness for every stranger who ever dialed that phone, and not one drop of it left over for me or my mother by the time he came home at 1 in the morning smelling like that station. His hands were shaking. He helped the whole valley. He just couldn't help being a father. Do you have any idea what that does to a kid? To watch your dad be a saint to people who don't even know your name and a stranger to you." Maggie did not answer. She had learned in 3 months in Calder that the kindest thing is sometimes to let a person finish. "The night my mother died," Russell said, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. There was a blizzard. Everything in Maggie went still. She'd been sick a long time. Her heart. And that night it started going, and I was 20, and I was at the hospital with her, alone, because my father was up on that hill reading road closures to a county full of people who weren't dying. He stopped. His eyes were wet, and he was furious about it. I called the station. I got through. I told him, "Mom's bad. Come now." And you know what he did. He stayed. He stayed on the air. He chose them over her, over us. He read his road closures, and he played his sad song, and my mother died at 4 in the morning, holding my hand instead of his. And I left this town 3 weeks later, and I have spent 30 years being right about him. And I am not going to let some woman with a pry bar and a folder of tapes turn him into a hero, now that he's safely dead. The diner was silent. Lori had stopped wiping the counter, and Maggie looked at this man, this furious, grieving son, and she understood 2 things at once. She understood why he wanted the hill scraped flat. And she understood that she was the only person on earth who knew there was a tape that said F4R. And that on it Walt Crane had said, "Tell him his mother told me to go." She did not say it. Not then. She was not ready, and neither was he, and some truths have to be given at the right moment or they shatter on the floor. But she leaned across the table and she said the only thing she had. "Russell," she said, "I have something of your father's. Something he made for you. I think you should hear it before you decide who he was." He laughed, a wet, ugly laugh, and stood up and put on his coat. "I know who he was," he said, and he left. If you've ever loved someone who left a wound in you that healed wrong, crooked, then you already know that Russell wasn't wrong about his father. He was just missing one piece. And the whole rest of this story is about the piece. Subscribe and stay with me, because Maggie is about to gamble everything she has on a single recording. She drove back up the hill that night and could not sleep because something was turning over in her mind, a sound, and around 2 in the morning she understood what it was. She went into the back room and pulled the blizzard tape down and threaded it to the place where Walt's voice broke, where he stopped mid-sentence for 4 full seconds and then said, "I'm going to play a song now," and played Faded Love all the way through and said nothing over it. She stopped the tape there and sat very still in the cold. The next morning she called Lori before the diner opened. "The blizzard tape," Maggie said. "The big one Hollis told me to play. What was the date on it?" There was a pause on the line. "Why?" Lori said. "I think I already know," Maggie said. "I need to hear you say it." A longer pause. Then Lori's voice gone soft. "That was the night Faye Crane died," she said. "Everybody in this county knows that storm. Walt stayed on the air the whole night and saved God knows how many of us. And his wife passed up at the hospital with just their boy beside her. He played that Patsy Cline record right about the hour she went. We always figured he knew, somehow, that he was saying goodbye to her the only way he had out loud to a whole valley, while he kept doing his job." Maggie set the phone down. The thing Russell had screamed at her across a diner table, the worst night of his life, and the thing she had wept over on a tape weeks before she ever knew its name were the same night. She had heard Walt Crane's heart break and not known whose heart or why or who else was breaking in a hospital 11 miles away. And she understood, finally, the full and terrible shape of what she was holding. There was one tape on that wall that could tell a furious, grieving man that his mother had used one of her last breaths to send his father away, and that the father had carried it alone, in silence, for 30 years. The way out of the legal trouble came, when it came, from the tapes themselves, and from the part of the ledger Maggie had not let herself look at directly back in the windowless room. Because Walt Crane, it turned out, had been a more mailman than even Hollis knew. In the green ledger, in the very back, behind the years of secret kindnesses, There was a different kind of entry in a steadier, older hand, dated more than a decade before he died. It was a record of a meeting with a lawyer in Broken Bow, and the establishment of a small trust and a number, and Maggie read it and called the lawyer's office and learned that the man was retired but alive, and she drove the 80 miles to see him. His name was Sam Whitcomb, and he was 86 and sharp as a tack, and when she told him she had bought the station and found the ledger, he put down his coffee and looked at her a long moment and said, "Well, so somebody finally did." He came back from a file cabinet with a folder soft with age. Walt set this up in his 70th year, he said. He knew the license could lapse, knew the town might lose the station, and he wanted to make sure that if it ever came alive again, it could never be sold out from under the valley. He created a charitable trust, the Calder Valley Community Broadcasting Trust, and funded it. Not with much. He never had much. But here was the clever part, Sam said, and he leaned forward. While he still owned that hill free and clear, he recorded a restriction right on the deed itself, dedicating the property to community broadcasting in the public interest, and barring forever any conversion to private commercial use. No cell tower lease, no carving it up, no cashing it out. A thing like that runs with the land, he said. It doesn't die with him. It rides along on the title to anyone who ever owns that ground. But the county sold it for back taxes, Maggie said. Doesn't a tax sale wipe the slate clean? Sam Whitcomb smiled, slow, the smile of a man who had once enjoyed his work very much. A tax sale clears the liens, he said. The money somebody's owed, that gets wiped, yes. But a use restriction isn't a lien. Nobody's owed $1 on it. It's a restriction on what the land can be, and Walt drafted it precisely so it would survive a transfer. Because he absolutely knew, that the tax man would come for that hill someday. He tapped the folder. So when you bought it, young lady, you bought the restriction along with it. It's on your title right now, whether you knew it or not. You can run a station up there till the cows come home, that's exactly what it's for. But you couldn't sell that hill to a wireless company for a king's ransom, Tim, if you wanted to. And neither, he said, watching her face, could anybody who ever tried to buy it out from under you? He built a fence around it after he was gone. And the fence holds. It was the thing that saved her in the end, though not the way courtroom stories usually go, because there was no courtroom. Russell had come at her 2 ways, and now both ways were closed. He had tried to buy the hill and lease it to a carrier, and the recorded restriction on the deed, his own father's hand, reaching out of the grave, made that worth exactly nothing, because no one, not Maggie, not Russell, not anyone, could ever turn that ground into a commercial tower lease. And he had tried to have the place condemned as a hazard so the county would take it and scrap it, and Dale Okafor's structural certification, stamped signed, knocked that flat. Maggie carried the deed restriction, and the certification, and a folder of letters that 11 townspeople had written by hand down to the county building and laid them on the counter. And there was nothing left of Russell's plan but paper. The hill could be a station serving the valley, or it could be nothing. It could never be a check. Walt Crane had reached out of his grave and closed the only door his son had spent 30 years trying to walk through. The educational footnote, the thing Sam Whitcomb made sure she understood, was this. A broadcast license in this country is not a property. It is a public trust. The airwaves belong to the people, and the law has always said, in words going back to 1934, that a station must operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Most people have forgotten that. The big companies that bought up the local stations and automated them and made them play the same 9 songs from a computer in another state forgot it on purpose. But Walt Crane never had. He had run a station in the public interest for 41 years and given the law its full and original meaning, and then he had used the dry machinery of a trust to make sure no one could ever forget it again. That is the kind of man he was. He fought for the town with a microphone while he was alive, and with a folder of legal paper after he was dead. When the lapsed license came up for the long process of being granted anew, the trust gave Maggie standing, and the town gave her testimony, and the public interest, that old, half-forgotten phrase, gave her a case. It would take most of a year, but it would come. Stay with me, because the day Russell Crane finally heard his father's voice is the day this whole story was built toward, and if you are still here, subscribe, because I would not want you to miss it. She went to him in December, in Denver, because she decided he should not have to come back to Calder to hear it. She drove the Corolla 400 miles through a country going white at the edges, the real marked FRR. Wrapped in a towel on the seat beside a portable deck Hollis had loaned her, and she found Russell in a condo that was nice and empty, in the way her own divorce had taught her to recognize. She learned only later how much that emptiness held, that his wife had left, that there was a daughter who did not call, that he had made of his life a colder echo of the very thing he hated his father for. He let her in because he was too tired not to. She set up the deck on his kitchen island. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, a 50-year-old man braced like a boy. "I'm not going to tell you what's on it," Maggie said. "I'm just going to play it. And then I'll leave, and you never have to think about me or that hill again. Okay?" He didn't answer. She pressed play. "Russell," his father's voice said, and Russell Crane flinched as if struck, because of course he had not heard that voice in 3 years, that low, smooth, worn voice saying his own name. "I'm an old man making a tape in an empty studio at 2 in the morning, the voice said, "because I've never once been able to say this to your face, and I'm running out of faces I'll get to see." So he took a breath. The tape hissed. "I need to tell you about the night your mother died." Russell's arms came uncrossed. "You think I chose the town over her," Walt said. "You've thought it 30 years and I've let you, because the truth was too heavy to mail. So here it is. That night when you called, I told your mother. I came home, you don't remember this, you were at the hospital already, but I came home first, and I told her, the county's snowed in, people are stranded. The church wants me on the air, but I'm not going, I'm coming to you. And your mother." A long silence on the tape, and Maggie watched a grown man's face come apart in his own kitchen. "Your mother took my hand," Walt said. "And she was so weak, and she said, 'Walter, you go.' She said, 'There are mothers out there tonight with babies and no heat, and you are the only voice they've got, and I have had 30 years of your voice, and I do not need it tonight as much as they do.' She said, 'Go and do what you were put here to do, and I will wait for you.' And then she said, and this is the part, Russell, this is the part I've carried," she said. "Tell Russell I told you to. Promise me you'll tell him I told you to." The voice broke completely now, an old man weeping alone in a dead studio. "And I promised her," Walt said. "And then I broke that promise for 30 years because I couldn't stand to say it. Because saying it meant saying she died while I was on that hill. And that is a thing I could not get my mouth around, son. So I let you hate me. It was easier to let you hate me than to tell you your mother spent one of her last breaths thinking about heated churches full of strangers' babies. That's who she was. You get that from her, the part of you that's good, you get it from her, not from me. I just had the microphone. The tape ran on." Walt Crane gathered himself. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to know. She told me to go. She held my hand and told me to go and save people I'd never meet, and I did it, and it was the worst and the most right thing I ever did, and she was at peace, and you were alone, and I will be sorry about that until they put me in the ground. But don't you spend your life thinking your father chose strangers over your mother. He chose, on her own orders, to be the man she'd spent 30 years loving. There's a difference, she knew it. I need you to know it too. Keep your porch light on for somebody, son. That's all I ever tried to teach this whole valley, and I never once managed to teach it to you in person. And that's my failing, not yours. The light's still on for you. It always was. Sign off." The tape hissed and ran out and slapped around and around the reel. For a long time Russell Crane did not move. Then he sat down on the floor of his own kitchen, this man in his expensive empty condo, and he puts photos in his hands, and Maggie did the only decent thing there was to do, which was nothing. She did not touch him, she did not speak. She let him have it, the grief he had been owed for 30 years and denied. The father he had buried twice, once in the ground and once in his own anger, and who had just now, on a strip of magnetic tape, climbed up out of both graves to tell him the one thing that changed everything. "She told me to go." When he could talk, he said into his hands, "She told him to go." "She did," Maggie said. "She told him to go, I know." He looked up, and his face was wrecked and 20 years younger. "The code letters," he said. "The lawyer, the hill? I'll call them off, He stopped. "I didn't know there were tapes," he said. "I thought I was selling a building. I didn't know I was selling." He couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. If you have made it all the way here, then you understand that this was never a story about a radio station. It was a story about a porch light and what it means to leave one on. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because there is one last thing Maggie found in that ledger, and it is the reason this story has a future and not just a past. Russell Crane came back to Calder in the spring, and he did not come to take. He came to give the trust the one thing it had never had, which was money, his own, the lease money his father had made impossible to take, redirected now into the very thing it had been meant to protect. He sat in the wagon wheel and ate Lori's pie and let the old men who remembered his father tell him stories about a man he was only now beginning to meet. He was not healed. You do not heal 30 years in a season. But he had stopped being right about his father, which is sometimes the beginning of healing, and he had started leaving his own porch light on, calling his daughter on Sundays, learning the slow, hard work of becoming the kind of man his mother had told his father to go and be. And the station came back. It took 11 months and a stack of paperwork as thick as a phone book and the testimony of a whole valley, but the license was granted, new and clean, a low-power community license held in trust, and on a Friday night in November, 14 months after a woman, with $611, pried a door off its hinges, Maggie Doyle sat down in the swivel chair in the front room with the dust scrubbed away and the meters glowing and Hollis Pruitt beside her, with tears in his pale blue eyes, and she put on the headphones, and she pulled the microphone down on its boom, and she found, after all those years in the drawer, the voice she had put away at 17. "Good evening," she said, and the signal went up off the tower and bounced down off a sky that had turned, at dusk, into a mirror, and it carried her voice out across the dark farmhouses of the valley, into kitchens and trucks and barns, 2 states wide. "This is the Calder Valley Station, back on the air after a long quiet, and my name is Maggie, and I'm new here. But the man whose chair this is was not new at all. His name was Walt Crane. A lot of you knew him. Some of you owe him more than you ever knew. And he left this station with a job, which I intend to keep doing, and the job is this: to pay attention. To notice who's about to go under and not let them. So here's how it works. The lines are open. If you're warm tonight, call in and play a song for somebody who isn't. And if you're not warm, if you're sitting out there in the dark, and you think nobody knows your name." She paused, and the whole valley paused with her. "We know it," she said. "Keep your porch light on for somebody. The light's on for you too, it always was." And the phone, which had not rung in 3 years, rang. There was one last thing in the ledger. And Maggie had found it the same night she found the trust. But she had kept it for herself a while, the way you keep a coal, banked through a cold night. On the very last page, after all the years of secret sums, after the propane bills and the eyeglasses and the funerals, Walt Crane had written, in a hand that had shook a little with age, a single final entry. It was not a number. It said, "To whoever comes after me. The account is never empty. You think it's money, and sometimes it is, but mostly it's just paying attention, and that costs you nothing but your own loneliness, which you were going to spend anyway. Keep the porch light on. Sign somebody else up. Don't let it go quiet." Maggie kept the porch light on. The Calder Neighbor Fund, which Walt had hidden behind a dozen fake sponsors for 41 years, she ran out in the open now, because times had changed and people could bear to be helped if you let them help back, and it paid Pearl Hutchins's propane and a young couple's hospital travel, and one hard winter, the back rent on the wagon wheel itself, so Lori could keep the coffee hot one more year. Theo Salas read the closures on bad weather nights. The project Walt had finished, now finishing others. Hollis Pruitt taught a 16-year-old girl from the Albright place how to keep the tubes lit, so the knowledge would not die with him, so there would always be young hands. And Russell Crane sent a check every month, and then sometimes drove up himself and sat in the back room with the door Maggie had pried off now rehung on good hinges, listening to the tapes, all of them, learning his father one stranger at a time, too late and yet not too late, because the voice was still in the air, because somebody had refused to let it go quiet. She had come to Calder with $611 and a dead marriage and a certainty, bone-deep 31 years in the making, that she did not matter and never had. She had bought the only thing she could afford, a station nobody wanted, a man nobody had finished mourning, a town that had forgotten how to listen to itself. And in the doing of it, she had found the thing Walt Crane had hidden in plain sight for 41 years and labeled with a phrase she finally understood. The porch light account. It was never about the money. It was about the simplest and most radical thing a person can do for another, which is to leave a light burning in the dark so that whoever is out there, lostless and cold and sure that no one knows their name, can see it and steer by it and find their way to the warm. The people nobody sees are usually the ones holding everything together. Walt Crane knew it, and now sitting in his chair with her own long-silenced voice going out into the dark, so did she. The light was on. It would stay on. None of them ever again would have to be out there alone.